So when we bought our first house, we wanted to put in a garden, and we had a lot of fields and lawn, and we were looking at different methods for building a garden on top of that kind of foundation. And one of the things I came across is lasagna gardening. It's called lasagna gardening because you layer it with a bunch of different materials. Basically, you put a layer of carbon-rich material and then a layer of nitrogen-rich material, and then repeat until you've built a garden bed. Like a carbon-rich material is brown matter, so leaves is a good example. Nitrogen-rich material is green matter, so you have grass clippings and manure and compost. Those are all green matters. And so just layer that one atop the other to form a lasagna garden. It's pretty nice because I've built gardens before where I've had to till the ground from scratch, and when you're doing that you might have to pull up rocks, you might not know what your soil type is, and it might not be the best soil for growing things. With lasagna gardening, the thing that really attracted me to it was the fact that you can control what goes into your garden. And growing up as part of the Back to the Land movement in Maine, my mom always told me that your garden gets better every year, but it's not going to be good when things start out because your soil just hasn't had time to develop. So if you want to fill your soil with nutrient-rich things, lasagna garden's a good way to do it because you control it. Another thing that attracted me about lasagna gardening was that supposedly after several years, you really don't have to weed your garden much. Growing up in Maine with the black flies and the mosquitoes, spending hours every day of the summer out weeding in my parents' gardens, it's not my favorite thing to do. Seriously, like we would wear bug nets and cover our whole heads, because if you were just out there in one place pulling up weeds in your garden, you'd get eaten alive. Anyways, supposedly the lasagna garden doesn't have that much weeding because you can control how many seeds go into your organic matter. So if you're gonna compost, it's great to reuse the scraps of food from your house or other organic materials and put it right back in your garden. But you really have to control whether there's seeds in that, and in the long run you won't have much weeding. Another thing that attracted me to it, it's a really inexpensive way to build a garden, and it reuses materials you already have on hand. So I am not gonna go buy a ton of fertilizers and chemicals or anything like that to build up the nutrients in my soil. What I'm gonna use is organic matter that already has those nutrients built into it. So for our lasagna garden, we had the following organic materials available to us. We had birch trees from our fallen birch trees on our land. We had a bunch of cardboard from moving from Oregon to Maine. Just tons of cardboard. We had organic hay and donkey manure. There was a mixture of the two from a local farmer up the road. On top of that, we wanted to add a carbon-rich substance. We had a mixture of seaweed and leaves from one beach, and I wasn't really excited to have all those leaves, but as things turned out, it was a good mixture. And then we also had a ton of pure seaweed that we put on top of that. So the way it worked was we put down the hardware cloth to keep out burrowing animals. It was definitely the biggest investment of our garden. It was about $170 for that, but we do have signs of some burrowing animals in our pond about 30 feet away, and we just didn't want to risk it. After you build all these materials up, the idea of then having to fight with the little animals and dig everything back up and put a layer of hardware cloth down just didn't seem worth our time. So we invested in that. The cardboard we put down specifically because it kills the grass. If you put a thick layer of it, we put about 2 sheets of cardboard over every space, then it will kill the grass, but also earthworms love cardboard. So we're trying to get as many earthworms as we can in our garden to really keep that soil healthy. And so cardboard was a good use. Also, it was a material we had on hand. It was free. You know, you really want to reuse things rather than throw them out, right? So it was a good way to reuse something that we had on hand. On top of that, we used birch trees, which is a carbon-rich substance. Birch trees are one of the trees that are listed as a good foundation for a garden. There are some trees that are not, and we just happen to have a ton of them lying around, so my wife and I grabbed them from around the property, put that down as a base layer. We didn't use really large pieces of birch because we wouldn't want it to create a lot of mold or bring in slugs. Really, it's just forming a base to raise the level of our beds, and also to create a nourishing substance at the bottom of them that will just keep giving back to the soil for years. On top of that, we put a mixture of donkey manure and hay from a local farmer. He was selling it for 15 bucks for a pickup truck load, and it actually covered all of our garden, just one pickup truck. So I was a little hesitant about hay because some people say that hay is not a good substance for lasagna gardening because it has a lot of seeds in it. But this sounded like really good stuff. It's organic hay that he grows to the specifications of horse racers. So it's a high quality hay. And I also heard from someone who's associated with MOFGA, this really cool farming organization in Maine. They said hay is really the preferred substance for a lot of people because if you pile it high enough, the seeds will actually cook out of it, and it's not a big issue for weeding in the long run. The alternative to hay is straw, and straw doesn't have seeds in it. Next, we want to put on a carbon-rich substance to keep that layering process going, and what we had on hand was seaweed with a lot of leaves mixed in with it. So seaweed is actually a kind of balanced substance. It has both carbon and nitrogen qualities. Really, that took 3 or 4 hours. We just drove to the beach 5 minutes away and loaded it up. We had to do some research on whether or not we were able to harvest it legally, and fortunately there are some stipulations, but you are allowed to harvest some on the coast of Maine. Check out the website for that. Make sure you're doing it right. And if you live in another part of the country, I'm sure there are laws pertaining to getting organic materials. So we were able to reuse all these organic materials for free, basically. And then on top of the last layer, we threw one more pure layer of seaweed. This stuff didn't have anything in it. It was just beautiful seaweed. Picked up at my parents' house, actually, further up the coast. Then our garden was about 2 feet tall at that point. We were pretty impressed because it was a lot of work moving all those materials around, and you want to make sure that your garden gets high enough that when it settles and all comes together, you're not just looking at the ground again. You want to have, you know, a 6-inch to a foot high garden. So we managed to pull that off, and we did it in December in Maine. Right, we moved in December, so getting it in was a huge goal of mine because we really want to support ourselves with a lot of beautiful produce this summer. And the thing with lasagna gardening is if you're putting all these raw materials on top of each other, they need time to break down. So putting them in December gives us a good 6 months, well, you know, a good 5 months before the growing season starts, and during that process, all those materials will bind together, probably create some really, really rich soil for us by the time we plant. In the spring, we're going to invest in buying a truckload of compost and a truckload of soil. Haven't gotten those rates yet, but it should not be very expensive compared to buying soil by a bag by bag from Home Depot or something like that. We will plant starts right into the garden, and those will you basically just need to focus your soil content right around the base of the start, and that way you don't have to cover your whole garden with soil. It's another time and money saving technique. We're pretty excited about it. And those roots of the plants will dig down into that seaweed, into that organic hay, manure, and maybe nutrients from the birch as well. So we're hoping the garden will really have a high level of nutrients right off the bat, as opposed to waiting years for it to develop. Anyways, for this December, what we did to finish off our lasagna garden, get it ready for the spring, we covered it with black plastic and some wool blankets and rug type packing materials. And what that does, in addition to helping things break down, it actually cooks out the seeds that are in the organic matter. The sun beats down on that black plastic, creates an oven in there, and it destroys all the seed content to some extent, and hopefully that will help us have less weeding down the road. The wool is a really good organic material, lets the soil breathe, while at the same time keeping out sunlight. So that's what it's going to look like. We're going to have the rows built layer upon layer upon layer, and then we're going to have the wood chip pathways in between. Really excited to see how it all turns out in the spring. Feel very lucky also to have been able to put it all in December in Maine. All right, it's May 12th. It's been more than 5 months since we put down the original materials for the lasagna garden. Let's see what's happened under this plastic all winter. We did buy a few more extra materials to build the garden. We bought a bunch of wood chips here and use those for the walking paths between our rows in our garden. We also bought a lot of cow manure, which we heard is one of the best types of manure you can buy. And that's it. Our garden beds are made. Time to plant.